Today is story time. I'm going to be talking about the meteoric rise of Exodia, the composition that pretty much broke Mythic Plus, or at least broke this season. I'm going to be telling the story of how I think that happened, why fixing it will be quite difficult, and why I hope this is just the beginning. I'll get to what I mean by that exactly towards the end of the video, so you can put your pitchforks down for now. And let's kick it off with what the composition is. Exodia composition is a Guardian Druid, a Fire or Frost Mage, Shadow Priest, Augmentation Evoker, and Holy Paladin. Now this might be surprising, but I think our story starts with Shadow Priest. It isn't because it does the most damage, it isn't because it brings the best buffs, it isn't because PI buffs fires combust so much that it makes it mandatory. It isn't actually either because of its utility. Now I'm saying utility in air quotes because what makes Shadow so good isn't actual utility. It isn't Power Word, Fortitude, and Purge. It's two abilities that fix poorly designed and implemented parts of the game. Now, unfortunately, those two abilities are unique to Priest. No other class in the game has access to these things. The first and possibly the strongest part of Shadow's entire toolkit in Mythic Plus is Mind Soothe. It's the ability that allows groups to avoid bad pathing. It single-handedly allows groups to go into keys like Brackenhide Hollow or Halls of Infusion or Alderman or Nelth's Lair and completely avoid the most dangerous mobs and packs. Mind Soothe is a little bit like Shroud if Shroud was on steroids. Shroud was long considered mandatory because it allowed groups to generally either skip the most dangerous pack in a dungeon or to avoid having to kill a pack that would put a group over count. Mind Soothe lets groups avoid all of the dangerous packs. It allows groups to play only the most optimal pools and routes, skipping all the hunters in Brackenhide Hollow while still opening all the cages, skipping 2 of the 3 dragon packs in Halls of Infusion, skipping all the double pelter packs in Nelth's Lair, skipping the Crocs in Alderman. In many keys, this sort of routing isn't really about being optimal or shaving off a little bit of time, it's about being viable. And Mind Soothe in this sense is mandatory, because the difference between pulling whatever you have to because it's standing in front of your group compared to pulling only the easiest, largest, most optimal packs is enormous. It's night and day. It's like running a whole different dungeon. I think Nelth's Lair is a decent example of this. Pretty much everybody knows in Nelth's Lair that the pelters are the most dangerous mobs in the dungeon, especially on a fortified week. Imagine if there were 2 versions of Nelth's Lair. Imagine if there was one version that had no pelters at all, and there was another version that had like 6 or 8 pelters. Now, the group that doesn't have to worry about pelters is obviously going to do better than the group that does. And it's not just in the 25 keys or the super high end, it also affects the lower keys. Imagine if you could go into Nelth's Lair and just never have to worry about having to heal people up from random damage from a pelter throwing a rock at them. If you only had to heal or tank or account for the avoidable damage. You could pull bigger, you could kill things faster, you could focus more on dealing damage as a healer rather than actually moving health bars back up. It affects all levels of keys and dungeons. The second piece of the puzzle for Shadow is Master Spell. Again, this is an ability that counteracts bad boss and mob design, similar to how Mind Soothe counters bad dungeon design. There are many abilities and boss mechanics in Mythic Plus for which Master Spell is the only counter. The final boss in Alderman, the overlap on the last boss of Underrot, the dragons in Halls, the list goes on. Master Spell is the only counter to many mechanics in Mythic Plus. This is kind of like imagining if one class had a way to stop unstoppable casts. Well, that class would be mandatory. And that is what Master Spell does. Going into some boss fights, or some fortified trash and just not having to worry about the main mechanic that makes that encounter dangerous is very strong. So those 2 abilities lock in why every group, I would say, needs a priest. As to why it's a shadow priest rather than a healing priest, well, that takes us to the next chapter in our story, which is the state of healing in Dragonflight. Specifically, how much the role has been nerfed. In beta, 10.0, 10.1, 10.1.5, the current state of healer balance is that there is one spec that sits far and above the other healing specs, and that is Holy Paladin. As to why groups effectively have to pick a Holy Paladin, well, that's because healing is the weakest role in Mythic Plus. And so groups are more incentivized to pick the strongest healer into the weakest role. And they do this two ways. The first is they pick the strongest healer in the game at the time. The second is from 10.1.5. They also bring an Augmentation Evoker to the group because it further buffs the healer. I'll get into Augmentation in a little bit. For now, Holy Paladin. The 10.1.5 rework for Holy Paladin removed any possible weakness that the spec had. Holy Paladins now excel at all types of healing. Group healing, tank healing, spot healing, burst healing, mobile healing, sustained rot healing, cooldown healing, non-cooldown healing. They do everything better than any other healer in the game right now, in Mythic Plus especially. They also bring the best externals with 1 minute sacrifice, aura mastery, the DR that got added to Glimmer, devotion aura, bop, lay on hands. They have the kind of externals that other healers wish they had. The reason why removing the weaknesses of Holy Paladin in 10.1.5 is such a big deal is because in raids, healers can play to their strengths while avoiding their weaknesses. The Mistweavers can stand still channeling Soothing Mists and play solely around their 1 minute Yulon cooldown. The Druids can roll 20 rejuves, the Discs can ramp and then AFK, the Holy Priests and Resto Shamans can ignore tanks and spot healing and just spam their AoE healing and so on. But in a Mythic Plus environment where there is only one healer, the weaknesses that a healing spec may have are exposed or highlighted. Healers that lack healing on the move or mobility healing can quickly turn some bosses into brick walls. Healers without good externals or tank healing can start building houses out of their fortified key bricks. And so on. 10.1.5 modernized Holy Paladins. It gave them a full healing toolkit with no weaknesses. They have everything they might need to keep their group alive. They have preemptive cooldowns, reactive cooldowns. They have good rotational throughput, good cooldown throughput. They can do a lot of their healing while on the run or on the move. They have externals to get through hairy moments or overlaps. They have excellent AoE healing, tank healing. They have the best spot healing in the game. They have it all. And they set the stage for the third chapter of this saga, which is the Augmentation Evoker. Now, to a lot of people, augmentation is the reason why Exodia is broken, and to a certain degree they're right. But I think a lot of them are right for the wrong reason. A lot of people think that augmentation is broken because it brings so much damage. But the real advantage to having an Augmentation Evoker, that it buffs the healer. It does this by giving them somewhere between 15 and 20% of their main stat, effectively permanently, while also bringing defensives for the group through Zephyr, the group wall, scales for the tank, rescue. It fills in the gaps that a healer may have so that the group can cover every damaging event with a cooldown. Now, healing and group survivability is the main advantage that augmentation brings, but its damage is no slouch either, especially the type of damage that it brings. It brings the type of damage that makes untimable keys timable, difficult keys easier, and that is burst or cooldown damage. The type of damage that enables the double, triple, or quad pulls that shave minutes off timers. Luckily, Breath of Eons is built around a 2-minute cooldown. So is, luckily, Power Infusion, and both Mage and Shadow cooldowns can be lined up for every breath, which means this DPS trio can, luckily, ascend to another plane of DPS existence every 2 minutes. The ability to combine Combust, Power Infusion, Breath can result in the sort of burst damage or the large pack in a dungeon dying quickly enough to make all the other DPS specs jealous. I would like to take a minute to throw in my hot take here, and that is that I believe that the real power of the Exodia composition, or at least the core imbalance of Mythic Plus compositions in 10.1.5, is this trio. It is any group with an Augmentation Evoker, buffing the strongest healer in the game, Holy Paladin, that gets to pick and choose what packs it fights in a dungeon while also bringing Master Spell to counter a lot of quite deadly mechanics, is so far and away stronger than any other healing or DPS composition that you could bring. A group that isn't playing with a Holy Paladin and doesn't have an Augmentation Evoker could quite literally be 20, 30, maybe even 40% weaker than another healer playing with other DPS. The rest of the composition effectively boils down into taking the strongest spec for that role. Guardian Druid is the tank of choice because it is by far the best tank in the game, and Fire Mage is the third DPS because it does the most damage. What locked in Exodia to the extent that it really pushed out a lot of other DPS specs is the fact that the utility and class buffs brought by Mage and Druid perfectly complement what the triple core already has. So bringing the Mage, again, makes your healer 5% stronger through Arcane Intellect. It also brings an extra cooldown or defensive cooldown for your group through Mass Barrier. Bringing the Druid brings more group healing through Wildfire and Dream Procs with enormous lay on hands regrowths, while also bringing Mark of the Wild and a second battle res. These two pieces of the puzzle fit together so well that playing anything else feels like a mistake. If you don't already have Mark of the Wild, why would you not bring a Druid? Especially if the Druid you can bring is the strongest tank in the game. If you don't already have a third DPS lined up, why not bring a Mage? They make your healer 5% stronger, they make your other DPS 5% stronger. They also bring an extra defensive cooldown to your party, some fantastic utility, while also bringing the most damage in the game. You combine all of this together and you get a composition that doesn't lack in any way. They have fantastic damage, fantastic funnel and priority damage. They can do enormous pulls because their cooldowns are extremely powerful, both defensively and offensively. The ability for a Guardian to just round up these enormous packs and really not worrying about dying because Incarn is so strong, and then the DPS can pop their cooldowns and everything just goes together so well. It really feels like the Exodia composition was built to synergize well with one another. As to why this is going to be difficult for Blizzard to fix, well, I think that simply nerfing the numerical power of these specs isn't going to solve the problem. Groups will still require a priest, groups will still take the strongest healer in the game to try and make up for it being the weakest role, which will be Holy Paladin. They will still take an Augmentation Evoker because it brings so much power for their healer to the key. And in a lot of cases, what makes these specs, even these other specs like Guardian and Fire Mage, so strong isn't necessarily their raw power, it's the fact that their toolkits are so well-rounded and so fleshed out. The second reason is that the toothpaste can't be put back in the tube. Blizzard are trying to do this. I don't think it's going to work out particularly well. The keys have already been timed. Rating has already been gained, the damage is done. The nerfs we saw a couple of weeks ago to Fire, Shadow and Augmentation that are being repeated again next week with further nerfs. They didn't do anything the first time other than rein the composition in to be closer to other compositions, but it's still the best composition in Mythic Plus. It still plays the best, it still has the most buttons and tools to bring to a key. Making it less powerful isn't going to fix the problem that it's still the most powerful. It may shorten the gap between Exodia and other compositions, but it's also creating another problem in that the difference between the Exodia composition next week, post-nerfs, and the Exodia composition that we got at the launch of 10.1.5 is enormous. So it creates other problems for the season. It effectively locks in the high keys that have already been timed, and it doesn't really help the diversity of Mythic Plus expand. Now, I'm not saying that I don't think Exodia should be brought into line. What I think is difficult is nerfing Exodia down to the level of everybody else. I think what Blizzard should be trying to do instead is to bring other specs up to that level. Now, I know that's far easier said than done, but that is my hope. It's also what I meant by saying that I hope this is just the beginning at the start of this video. One of the things that surprised me about playing the Exodia composition in Keys was that Keys became much more of a group effort, or at least that's the way it felt. And that is because of the synergies within the group. Everyone in the group has a button that can help other people in the group live. It's not just on the healer. You have Master Spell and Mass Barrier, BE, Zephyr, Group Wall. It helps make traditional healer checks feel like a group check and a group effort. We all have ways to live and buttons to press to answer dangerous mechanics. Everyone in the group has a button that helps kill a dangerous pack or a specific mob or a boss, whether that's funneling damage into the most dangerous mob in a pack, or it's the Shadow Priest giving the Mage PI, or the Combust giving the group a crit bonus, or the Evoker pressing Breath, the Paladin pressing Summer. We as a group can run into a big pack, or especially a big Lust pack, and have ways of contributing to killing that pack that isn't just our role. And that can be even things like helping the tank move around while he's rounding up a big pack with life grip, or the hover speed buff, or rescue. It feels like everyone has ways to contribute to making that pack die. Rather than some other compositions as a healer, it might feel like you're kind of just waiting there for the DPS to do their job. Everyone in the group also has a button that stops a bad thing from happening, like casts going off, or fixates, or AoEs channeling. There's DB, or Raw, knock up, knock back, upheaval, blind, fear. Everyone has buttons they can press to stop bad things happening, rather than just hoping that the other person in the group who has that button presses it. This to me has been the real joy of playing the Exodia composition. I mean, doing crazy amounts of damage and lots of healing and stuff is great, but making the keys feel like truly group efforts was the best part about it. Not just the numerical power. Survivability didn't feel like it was only on the tank and healer. Damage didn't feel like it was only on the DPS. Living through healing check bosses became a matter of rotating VE with mass barrier, with Zephyr, with wall, with healer cooldowns. Even little things like the priest being able to throw a power word shield on the squishy guy before the knock up on Altyrus, or before the chain lightning goes out on the last boss. Killing the big packs or dangerous bosses and adds was about the healer also contributing damage by using Summer with Combust and PI and Breath, and then the shield going off so that the healer could safely and calmly contribute even more damage or get in a better position or whatever, while the Breath shield was protecting the team. The whole experience felt much more like a group effort, where everyone had ways to contribute to all aspects of the group's success rather than only their role. And this is what I'm really hoping Blizzard leans into. When I say that I hope Blizzard brings other specs up to the standard or up to the level of the Exodia composition, this is what I'm talking about. I don't just want numerical buffs. I want to be able to invite a hunter into a group and get some kind of benefit for the group by doing that. Now, like I said, this is a lot easier said than done. But unfortunately, what we have at the moment isn't a world where no one has those buttons. What we have is a world where some healers have a complete toolkit and some don't. Some groups can be built around increasing the power of their healer by like 20%, and some don't. Some groups can get to pick and choose which mobs they pull and which routes they go with, and some don't. Some groups get to invite 3 DPS that also bring survivability cooldowns for the rest of the group, and some don't. And I think this is the biggest problem with balance in Mythic Plus right now. It isn't necessarily just the Exodia composition, it's the fact that some specializations are just built so much better than others, and it isn't just numerically about damage or healing. What gives me hope that this is what Blizzard are trying to do is that all of the specs in the Exodia composition, all luckily, I guess, are also the specs that Blizzard has worked on most recently. Guardian Druid, Shadow Priest, Fire Mage, Holy Paladin, Augmentation Evoker. I'm hoping that they set the standard for the modern specialization going forward, and I'm hoping that the other specs all get brought up to those kinds of levels. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and algorithm stuff.